Speaking with many clients over the years, I have found that choosing the right paint color can be one of the most intimidating and overwhelming decisions that we make when it comes to decorating our homes. We are faced with so many different options, information, and often conflicting advice that can easily lead to a decision paralysis, if you will. So in this video, I'm hoping to share with you not only some of my favorite neutral paint colors, but also share with you my own decision process when it comes to selecting paint colors, and also demystify some of the things that come into play when we choose paint colors, for example, undertones. When it comes to neutral paint colors, especially lighter to mid-tone colors, neutral walls are never intended to be the star of the show. They're intended to be a more understated backdrop, and yet they tend to be the trickiest to get right. And that is because of a couple of things. The first reason is that lighter neutral wall colors tend to be more affected by external conditions such as quality of light in your space, the exposure, and what's happening outside the window, much more than darker or more saturated colors. For example, a particular neutral color can read very differently in a room that has western or southern exposure and receives a lot of sunlight versus a room that's much darker or has northern exposure. Similarly, if you have a wall of foliage outside, that can cast a greenish tint onto a neutral wall color that will be significantly more visible than if you were working with a more saturated or darker color. For that reason alone, it's incredibly important to test paint colors, in particular those neutral paint colors in your specific space. And this is advice that you've heard time and again, but I cannot stress how important it is. We often use the internet, Pinterest, YouTube, Instagram to do our research, and that's a great starting point. By all means, use my recommendation in this video or recommendations of other designers or fellow homeowners as your starting point, but always test those recommendations in your own space because they can read quite differently in your own home. Now, how do I test paint colors? I don't do what's often recommended or seen, and that is painting multiple paint colors on the wall. I find that when you paint multiple colors side by side, what you're doing is you are able to evaluate them relative to one another, but that's doing very little for you to be able to evaluate a single color and how it will read in your space. Instead, what I like to do is I like to get large paint samples, and there's a couple of companies now that I really like using that use actual paint as opposed to ink on relatively large samples. One of them is Samplies, the other one is Hello Paint. And the beauty of these is, again, they use real paint as opposed to ink on paper, so they're much more representative of the actual paint colors. And they're relatively large and they're peel and stick, so you can put them on a wall and then move them around. I like to use a few of each color so that I can place them, for example, in corners. Light can bounce off walls very differently in corners, so you'll be able to really evaluate how a given paint color behaves, not just on flat walls, but also in those corners. And if you already have the white walls, you can place those samples directly on the wall. But if your walls are a different color, I encourage you to get a large Bristol board and place those samples on a white Bristol board. If you place them directly on another color, the way they read will be very different from their absolute value. So I encourage you to place them on a white Bristol board or another substrate that is white. Now, another reason why neutral paint colors can be quite tricky is because undertones become much more important with neutral colors than more saturated or darker colors. And you want to make sure that the undertones of your wall color do not compete with the undertones of other elements in your space. Now, I'm sure you've heard a lot about undertones already, so if you understand the concept and know how to determine the undertones of a paint color, that's great. But if you don't, I want to spend a couple of minutes explaining the concept and explaining why it's so important and how to determine what the undertones of a paint color are. Now, what an undertone is, it's essentially a base color peeking through a paint color, but not just paint. The same pertains to flooring, tile, backsplash, countertops, fabrics, essentially any decor element that has color. There are very few paint colors or fabrics or flooring, especially neutral ones, that don't have an undertone. Most will have either yellow or pink, perhaps green or blue undertone. And I think the reason why undertones can be confusing to people is because even though they understand what undertones are, they have a difficult time determining what undertones of a given paint color or fabric or flooring are. And the reason this happens is because people often try to determine the undertones by looking at a piece of fabric or paint swatch in isolation on its own. Now, sometimes you may be able to determine the undertones that way. You know, you may have flooring that has decidedly yellowed undertones, and that's visible right away. But more often than not, when you're dealing with neutral colors, determining undertones is much more difficult. You may look at a piece of fabric again or a paint swatch and it reads warm. You know it's warm, it's not cool, but you don't know if that warm comes from yellow undertones or red undertones. The only way to really determine what those undertones are is by placing two or more fabric samples or paint swatches or tile samples side by side. It's only when we have them, when we can evaluate them relative to one another, that those undertones start to pop. You will immediately see, without much prior training, you'll be able to see that suddenly one color is reading decidedly pink versus another color in that comparison, or perhaps it's starting to read decidedly more yellow. But again, that will only happen if you are evaluating them side by side. Now, I was recently doing a consultation with a client who had decorated her laundry room, and she purchased white tile and she was painting the walls white. Both of them looked white to her. She did not test the paint color against the tile. It wasn't until the walls were painted that the tile started to read decidedly pinkish and the walls were looking dingy and yellow. In absolute terms, both elements were white, but it wasn't until they were put against one another that one was reading pink and the other one was reading yellow. When she repainted the walls with white that had more pink undertones, guess what? Neither the tile nor the wall were reading pink. They were both reading white. That's because the undertones were now aligned. So if you've been intimidated by the whole notion of undertones and unsure how to evaluate them, please know that even those of us with a trained eye don't evaluate undertones in isolation. So how does it all relate to choosing the right paint color? If you already have fixed elements in your place, so you have your flooring, you have your countertops or backsplash or cabinetry color, you want to be sure to test your paint samples against those fixed elements. For example, if you have traditional red oak flooring that has kind of a honey stain that has yellow undertones, you will want to be sure that the paint color you're using has yellow undertones. It will create a much more pleasant visual than if you were choosing a paint color that has pink undertones. And again, you may say, well, I would never choose anything that has yellow undertones or anything that has red undertones. But remember, in absolute terms, those undertones may not be really visible. It's not until you are pairing it with another neutral that they will start to pop. And conversely, if you have, let's say, travertine floors that tend to have more pink undertones, you may not want to choose paint color that has yellow undertones, because again, that pairing may not be as visually pleasing as you'd like. Now, there are a few additional tips that I want to share with you. Coordinating undertones is most important when the various decor elements that you're pairing, there's only a few shades difference between them. It becomes really less important when you're pairing lighter colors with much darker colors or more saturated colors. So for example, if I'm pairing navy blue with my light or mid-tone neutral walls, undertones are not as important. Now, I still encourage you to test them and put them against the other elements just to be sure that you like the visual, but they're not as critical. And undertones are particularly important when the two decor elements touch each other or are in immediate physical proximity. So for example, if you're painting your mantle and you already have light stone surround, you want to be sure that those two surfaces have coordinating and not competing undertones. I find that when different decor elements are separated and are not in immediate proximity, things are much more forgiving. So, I may have a wall paint that has yellow undertones, even if my sofa that's not against the wall, it's further away, the fabric has more pink or taupe undertones. You have more leeway because you're not making that direct comparison. So with all that said, let me spend a few minutes sharing my favorite neutral paint colors with you that are my go-tos for client projects, and I will explain when to use them and when not to use them. Let's start with the lightest of them all for those of you who are looking for white walls. My absolutely favorite white paint color is Benjamin Moore's Simply White OC 117. It is my go-to because I find it to be incredibly versatile. It works with a number of different color palettes. It's bright and crisp, but never sterile. And I've never had a client who did not love this color. Now, it does have yellow undertones, but I find that it is bright enough and those yellow undertones are subtle enough that I can still pair it with items that have a little more of a pink undertone, and it tends to work really nicely. I've also used it with things like Carrara marble that has blue undertones. For example, I used it in my kids' bathroom and it works really well. Now, those yellow undertones may pop a little more in south or west facing rooms that have a lot of sunlight. So if that is the case, I again encourage you to test it and then pair it with those other decor elements to make sure that you are comfortable with the amount of yellow that sunlight brings out. Now, if you are a little bit gun shy about yellow undertones and you want to go with white walls that have very little undertones, and that gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of pairing it with blue undertones or red undertones or yellow undertones, consider Benjamin Moore Chantilly Lace. Chantilly Lace is one of Benjamin Moore's purest whites. It means it has very little undertones, so it's going to give you a lot of flexibility, but it is a much brighter, starker white, so you need to be comfortable with that. Next on my list is Benjamin Moore Swiss Coffee OC 45. It is a beautiful off-white that has historic value to it in my eyes. In fact, my entire home is Swiss coffee. I truly love it. It has yellow greenish undertones. Again, don't be afraid of that. In absolute terms, it's not going to read yellow or green. It has just a lot more meat and depth to it. That's something like a bright Simply White or Chantilly Lace. But you need to be comfortable with that, and you want to be sure that any elements that are immediately adjacent to your Swiss coffee walls don't have pink or red undertones, because that will make the walls feel a little too yellow or too green. If you're looking for a great light taupe for your space, Benjamin Moore Pale Oak is a wonderful color. Now, pale oak has red undertones, so you want to be sure that you are not pairing it with anything that has strong yellow or green undertones. But if you, for the most part, have a palette of taupes, or perhaps you're pairing it with more saturated or darker colors, it can be a wonderful option. But again, we always want to test it in our own space. It can also be great if you have a lot of foliage outside your window that can cast a bit of that greenish tint onto your walls, because the red undertones will help neutralize that greenish tint. Now, another great lighter neutral is Benjamin Moore Edgecomb Gray. It is a beautiful warm gray or grayish, and it actually has relatively little undertones. If you do a bit of research on it, you'll sometimes find that people are reporting different undertones. Some people say a little blue, a little more green. Others will say sometimes pink will pop. That's just good proof that undertones here will pop depending on the conditions of your room. Again, what's happening outside the window, the type of exposure and sunlight that you receive. But it has relatively little undertones, and therefore it can be very flexible in the types of decor elements you can pair with it. So that's definitely a great contender to consider. Now, the one space you may be a little careful about when it comes to Edgecomb Gray is north-facing rooms or rooms that receive little light, because in those spaces it can read a little too gray and a little too drab. And last but not least, for those of you who would like a beautiful soft gray that is a little cooler, it has blue undertones, perhaps your color palette is a little bit cooler, consider Farrow and Ball's Dimpse. It's a beautiful soft gray. Again, it has that wonderful historic value that a lot of Farrow and Ball colors have. And again, it could be a wonderful option for those of you who are leaning a little more towards cooler tones. I hope this video was helpful. Do let me know in the comments if you have any questions. And if you enjoyed the tips and techniques I've shared with you in this video, do check out the link in the description. I do have something for you that will help you learn how to decorate like a designer.